Hey guys, it's Bella and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be doing another Mystery Monday video, and today we're going to be talking about the Claremont serial killer, and this case actually is so close to home for me because I was born 10 minutes from where all of this was happening at the time that this was happening. And I remember my mum and my dad telling me about this case and the fact that there was just blanket news coverage about this at the time. My mum was telling me actually how my uncle, or her uncle, but I also call him uncle. So what is he, like my great uncle? I don't know, but he knew the dad of one of the victims. So this case obviously took place in Claremont, which is in Perth in Western Australia in the mid 1990s. And Claremont was a very well-off, wealthy suburb, and it was also a suburb that a lot of younger people went to party. It had a really good nightlife at the time, and that was all until these disappearances and murders started happening. And the first one actually took place on the 26th of February in 1996 when 18-year-old Sarah Spears disappeared. So Sarah's parents were Don and Carol. She also had an older sister named Amanda, who she was incredibly close to. She was actually really close to her entire family. She was a very family-oriented person. She was also described as just like a really cheerful, happy, fun-loving girl that always had a smile on her face. And her sister went to the same school. They went to the Iona Presentation College, which was, or still is, an all-girls private school in Mosman Park. And when they graduated, Sarah and Amanda actually got an apartment together in south of Perth. So like I said, they were really, really close. And Sarah ended up getting a job as a secretary at an engineering consultancy company. So Friday the 26th of January, which I think that I said it was February before. I always get so muddled up in my head when I do these cases, and I mistake so many things because there's so much information. But this was Friday the 26th of January, and it was Australia Day, which Australia Day, it's a long weekend. It is a time where people in Australia just go out and get drunk as fuck, basically. So Sarah and her girlfriends were all out. They decided to start off the day by going to an open air concert at Kings Park, which is a massive botanical garden in Perth. It is literally like one of the biggest inner city botanical gardens in the entire world. It is 400 hectares, which is just an insane amount of space. And it overlooks Perth. It's right on the edge of Perth's central business district. Then later that evening after that, Amanda picked Sarah and her friends up, and then she dropped them off at the Ocean Beach Hotel, which was in Cottesloe, which is just like the next suburb over from Claremont. Amanda didn't come in with them. She just dropped them off and then went to go to a friend's house, which wasn't too far away, and then she came back at around midnight to pick them up and then take them to Club Bayview, which was in Claremont. And this place was already like super popular at the time, but it was Australia Day, so it was especially chock-a-block. Sarah and her friends had been going all day, so she was getting a little bit tired at around 2 a.m. and decided she was going to go and get a taxi to go home, but her friends decided to stay because they wanted to keep going, so she left. She talked to the security guards on the way out because she was good friends with one of them, and then walked 500 meters to the corner of Stirling Highway and Stirling Road to a phone booth to call the Swan taxis. So it was 2:06 a.m. when she called the taxi company to order a taxi from where she currently was to Mosman Park, which she was actually going to stay at a friend's house because south of Perth was a lot further away. It would have been more expensive, and Mosman Park was only 10 minutes away. So she ordered her taxi, and then she turned and crossed the road so that she could wait for the taxi on the other side of the road. Now, while she was waiting, it was actually right near an intersection of traffic lights. There were these three guys pulled up at a red light, and they noticed her there. When the light went green, they noticed the car behind them pull up to where she was, and I think they began talking, but the guys in the car I mean, they were a little bit concerned and they considered stopping and asking if she was okay, but for all they knew, the car could have been anyone. It could have been a friend picking her up, her sister, it could have been, you know, a taxi getting her, so they just decided to keep going, and they didn't say anything about the make or model of the car, so I guess they didn't really pay too much attention to it. But then 3 minutes after the call, so it was a very short time frame from 2:06 to 2:09 a.m., the taxi pulled up because it was literally only at Eric Street in Cottesloe, which was 3 minutes away. And by the time the taxi pulled up, she was gone. It did 3 loops to try and, you know, see if she was coming or if they missed her, but she was nowhere to be found. And she was actually never seen again. The next morning, Amanda woke up and went to go and check her bedroom to see, you know, check on her and how she was going, how hungover she was, I suppose. But her bed hadn't been slept in. So she called her mum, and her mum hadn't heard from her. Neither of them could get in contact with her, so they contacted all of her friends, none of which had heard from her or seen her or knew where she was, which was really, really unlike her not to tell anybody where she was. She would always tell someone where she was going or if her plans changed. So her mum decided to call her dad, who was actually 3 hours away because he worked as a sheep shearer and he was 3 hours away from work. And as soon as he got the call, he dropped everything and he made the 3-hour drive back home, which is when they went and told the police. Now, immediately, the police thought the whole situation was pretty sketchy based on what the parents had told her about Sarah being so family-oriented, and within 48 hours, they called the Major Crime Squad in, her friends, family, even some volunteers from the community. 35 people, or up to 35 volunteers at a time, were out handing photos and missing persons photos of Sarah out to the community. They handed out 35,000 missing persons posters. Not long after that, they started receiving so many calls, just being absolutely bombarded with calls, with unfortunately prank callers and a lot of clairvoyance. And it was a really sad situation because the family just wanted to find her so badly that every time a clairvoyant called up and said, you know, oh, I saw in a vision that she was here or that her body was here or whatever, Don would go and check all of these leads out, and he every time was disappointed because her body was never found. They're just taking advantage of these poor people. I personally don't believe in clairvoyance, and in this case, it's just so sad because when they called up, they would have known that they knew nothing and that they were just pulling this out of their ass. And they were just sending this poor family on a wild goose chase, just going all over the town trying to find their daughter. Oh, it's just so sad to me just thinking about that. So anyway, back to the investigation. Taxi drivers became a massive part of the investigation because there was just such a high demand for taxis and just not enough of them to go around. So people started like pretending to be taxis, kind of like an unofficial version of Uber. And so after the disappearance, obviously there was a massive crackdown on this because there was just no way to monitor it. A few taxi drivers came forward trying to help or give any sort of information they could, including a man named Stephen Ross, who claimed that the night before he actually dropped Sarah and 2 other people off. So one was a woman who he dropped off first, then he was going to drop the man off in the city and also Sarah off, and he stopped to drop Sarah off at the Windsor Hotel in south of Perth, which is right near where she lived. And then apparently something weird happened. The man like shoved Sarah out and got out with her and paid for the cab fee, and then the taxi driver didn't know what happened after that. But I couldn't find out any more information about that, so I'm assuming either it was a dead lead or they ruled it out. 5 months later, in the early hours of June 9th in 1996, 23-year-old Jane Rimmer disappeared. Jane grew up about 10 minutes away from Claremont in a place called Shenton Park. Her parents, Trevor and Jenny, also had 2 other children, which were Jane's older brothers, Lee and Adam. And she actually went to the same school as Amanda and Sarah, the Iona Presentation College, but obviously at different times because of the age difference. Now, she was just a really beautiful human being, and everyone described her as just having a really kind heart, and she loved working with children. So after she graduated, she managed to secure a job at a childcare centre, which was like her dream. After work, every day she would call her parents because they were extremely close. And at this point, everybody knew about Sarah Spears' disappearance because 2 months after her disappearance, I mean, there was just a lot of coverage on it. Firstly, but 2 months after her disappearance, Don and Carol actually wrote an open letter, which was absolutely heartbreaking, just like pleading for any information on her disappearance or her whereabouts. And this was about 3 months before Jane's disappearance, so she was very aware of it and was very cautious. She would always pay for her friends' taxis to make sure that they were getting in a legit taxi and that they were going to get home safe. So on the 9th of June, her and her friends were going to go out and have a few drinks. So her dad picked her up from her apartment and dropped her off at the Shenton Hotel, which is where her mum worked. And they were just going to have a quick drink before she met her friends at the Ocean Beach Hotel. Which, if you remember, the Ocean Beach Hotel is the same one that Sarah Spears was also at the night of her disappearance. So they stayed at the Ocean Beach Hotel for about an hour before they decided to get a taxi and head over to the Continental Hotel at around 9:30. And then after that, they decided to go to Club Bayview, which was only a block away. So I think they walked and they got there and they just saw that it was absolutely packed, and they were like, one of their friends was actually having a house party that night in the suburbs, so they just decided they were going to get a taxi, go to that instead. But when they went to the taxi rank, Jane decided that she was actually going to stay, and so her friends just went on without her. They just thought that she'd met someone, or there was, a guy there or something that she wanted to talk to. Now, the next day, she was meant to have her weekly Sunday roast lunch with her family, but she never showed up, and she never called them to let them know that she wasn't going to come, which was extremely unlike Jane. First of all, to miss her weekly Sunday lunch with her family, but especially because she didn't call them to let them know she wasn't going to come, which, I mean, I feel like that's weird for anyone. Even if you're not super close with somebody, you still call them up to let them know that you're not going to be able to make it. So they tried calling her, they didn't get an answer from her, and so they actually had a spare key to her apartment. They decided to go over there, check on her. Obviously they knocked first, didn't get an answer, so they opened the door with their key and realized that she hadn't been there. Her bed hadn't been slept in. Now, as I mentioned, she knew, and everybody knew about Sarah's disappearance at this point, so immediately her parents were freaking out. They waited until the next day, Monday, to see if she went into work. They called up her work and they said that she never came in, and she never called up to say that she wasn't coming in. So straight away they contacted the police and reported her missing. The police arrived really shortly after they called them, and immediately they sort of linked the two cases together and thought that maybe they were dealing with some sort of serial perpetrator, but they didn't announce this to the public straight away. They did, however, announce the formation of a task force called the Macro Task Force, which was dedicated to finding the perpetrator of both of these cases. Detective Paul Ferguson was announced as the head of the task force. They also made everybody in the task force sign a confidentiality agreement to not talk about the case with anybody who wasn't in the task force, but also, even if you were in the task force, you could only talk about the case in designated, safe spots. So you couldn't just go and talk about it at a bar after work or something like that, or on your lunch break, which actually one officer did do that and was fired. The task force also had 2 meetings every single day at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. to ensure that everybody was on the same page and no information was missed. Officers were also encouraged to partake in counseling sessions, whether or not they thought they needed it, and if the counseling sessions sort of indicated that they weren't coping very well, then they would be kicked off of the task force. So they kind of wanted everyone to be at the top of their game if they were going to be part of this task force. They also had some very questionable methods. The task force did get sort of mixed responses. Some people were all for it, but some people were very critical of their methods. And one of their methods was this questionnaire that they did. And they brought in 101 people to partake in this questionnaire, suspects. And they asked questions like, did you do this? Why are we meant to believe you? Which a lot of people just thought was really stupid because, you know, the person is not just going to come in there and be like, yep, it was me. You know? They also kept so much of the case under wraps and just nobody knew about it except for those in the task force. They only released some information 10 years later. Some of it is coming to light just recently, which we'll get into later. But there was so much of the case that they kept hidden, and I can understand that to an extent because their reasoning behind this was so that if they did catch the perpetrator, only that person, the person directly involved with these crimes, would know these specific details, which does make sense because then people can't falsely confess. You know, like people in prison always like to do that to get special treatment or to take credit for crimes that they didn't commit, like the guy that tried to take credit for John Bonet's murder, which was just so dumb. And everyone was commenting on my video saying it's been solved, but that guy actually confessed at the start when John Bonet originally was murdered. He's just trying to get his 10 seconds of fame. And I got a little bit off topic here, but that is what happened. So I understand why they kept some of it under wraps, but some of it just didn't make sense to me. For instance, 10 years later, they released CCTV footage of the night Jane Rimmer disappeared, and it shows her talking to a man. He approaches her and her face seems to light up, and then the camera pans away, and then 28 seconds later it comes back and her and this man are gone. And they didn't release this footage until 10 years later. And like, I mean, I'm sure they had their reasonings, but also I feel like if they released it, you know, somebody could have known the person in the footage and could have come forward saying, yes, I know who that person is. I mean, it's CCTV footage, so it's not the most clear thing, but they could make out Jane from it, so maybe someone could have made out this man. Anyway, 6 weeks later, on the 3rd of August, a woman, her husband, and their 2 children were out in Wellard, which is a rural area. It's about 40 kilometers south of Perth, so about a 30-minute drive. And they were there stopped picking some water lilies, which is when the woman stumbled upon a body which was completely naked. She started yelling, she called for her husband and immediately called the police. She stayed with the body until the police arrived because she didn't want to leave the young girl's body alone. Now, when the police arrived, the body was so heavily decomposed that they weren't able to directly identify her. They had to use dental records to identify the body of that of Jane Rimmer. They also managed to calculate the time of her death based on the life cycle of the bugs on her body, so she had been there exposed to the elements for about 52 days. Almost all of her jewelry and her handbag were missing except for her belly button ring and a watch which was found nearby. And they scoured the place top to bottom to see any other, you know, possible DNA information, leads that they could take from this area, if there was anything that could lead them to Sarah Spears or anything like that, but they didn't find anything. They collected a little bit of DNA, but DNA testing wasn't great back then. So they didn't really get any leads from the dead body. So they continued their investigation and they were working off the basis that the killer lived in the Claremont area. Everybody at this point was considered a suspect. Trevor even was asked for a voluntary DNA sample. 78 taxi drivers lost their jobs. They questioned local sex workers to see if they had any clients that were sexually perverted or anything out of the ordinary. They also made appeals to the public. As I said, there was so much news coverage at the time, and they made appeals to the public asking anyone for any information, but people were really scared at the time, so they just started to blame everyone, blame their friends, blame their spouses, blame, their siblings, their families. None of it helped. None of the people that called in gave any solid leads. The police did try and follow them, but nothing came of it. So they were trying to think of who could have done this. They were thinking, it had to have been someone that they trusted. Maybe a taxi driver, because at this point they were thinking whoever took them, the girls went willingly. So they were thinking it's a taxi driver, or maybe somebody they had met that night, or maybe it was a friend, someone they mutually knew. So they were trying to look into what were the similarities, what connected the two cases. They thought, they both had similar builds, they both were blonde, beautiful girls, they both were of a similar height, similar age, they both went to the same school, they both were abducted from around the same place, but nothing was showing up any leads. And then on Friday the 14th of March in 1997, 9 months after Jane's body was discovered, 27-year-old Cara Glennon disappeared. Cara was born in a bush hospital in rural Zambia when her Irish parents, Dennis and Una, decided to move to Africa to take up teaching. She was described as fun-loving, extremely caring, and a little bit feisty, but she was very, very popular with everybody that knew her. She was an amazing ballet dancer, she spoke fluent Japanese, and she also worked as a solicitor at James Blake Walden in Perth. She actually had only recently gotten back, like a week or two before her disappearance, from a year-long backpacking holiday that she went on in Europe, and she was back for her sister's wedding because she was going to be a bridesmaid, and the wedding was about a week after her disappearance, which is so incredibly sad. So she had returned to her job as a solicitor at the same firm, and on the 14th of March, they were all going to go out for after-work drinks, all of the colleagues, kind of like as an early St. Patrick's Day celebration, because St. Patrick's Day was like 3 days later, and they were all going to go to the Continental Hotel. So it was her, a guy named Neil Ferris, who she had known for about 2 to 3 years, because one, he was her colleague, and two, he had known her dad for like 16 years or something, because he was a friend and also a client of the firm. And then there was also 2 other colleagues with them. So Neil left first at about 11 p.m. and then I think at the time Cara was talking to a couple of people at the hotel, and then she ended up leaving 15 minutes later at 11:15 p.m. So she told her friends and her colleagues that she was just going to grab a taxi home, and she walked down a Bayview Terrace down to Sterling Highway. So as she walked down Sterling Highway, she passed 3 men at a bus stop. They were like across the road from her, and they were calling out to her, yelling to her, saying that she was crazy for hitchhiking, and I guess they thought she was hitchhiking, maybe she was, but she just kind of dismissed them, like just waved them off, and kept walking down Sterling Highway. She walked past the Claremont Baptist Church, which is where she was seen talking to an occupant of a light-colored car. So the 3 guys at the bus stop saw this. They couldn't make out the model. They couldn't make out anything else about the car except that it was a light model car. It was actually right near that same intersection that those 3 guys saw Sarah Spears, at the intersection of Sterling Road and Sterling Highway, right near the lights. So the guys, I guess they weren't taking that much notice of it. They just kind of looked away, talked amongst each other for a few seconds, and when they looked back, Cara and the white car were both gone. The very next day, she failed to turn up for a hairdresser's appointment for her sister's bridal shower, and then that same night, she also didn't show up to her sister's hen's party, which was a major red flag. No one could get in contact with her, so her family immediately reported her missing and went out looking for her. Now, by this point, police were absolutely certain that they were dealing with a serial perpetrator. So they finally decided to tell the public what they thought that they were dealing with when they also released the details of Cara's disappearance.
That a serial killer is prowling the streets of Perth. After the disappearance of 3 women from the same Perth night spot, police are now certain they're looking for a methodical killer stalking young women.
We certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth as well.
All the circumstances are exactly the same as the first two. In fact, the location, everything smacks of a serial killer now.
Now, the case was massive at this point. Pretty much the entire police force was working on it, and the Glennon family were very well off and very well connected, to say the least. And Dennis was actually friends with Richard Court, who at the time was WA's premier. So he got him to make a public statement and offer a $250,000 reward for any information on any of the 3 disappearances. They also had a local newspaper print and distribute 5,000 missing persons reports to try and help find Cara. And within the following week of doing that, police received 35,000 calls of people trying to call in tips and leads, none of which led to anything. The macro task force also had 10 teams each, with at least 6 people on the floor in each team, all of which had multiple missing persons to look into. In the first week alone from Cara's disappearance, there were over 50 persons of interest that they just couldn't eliminate any of them. The police also questioned Neil Ferris for over 7 hours because there were rumors that they were romantically involved, but nothing ever came of it, and he was ruled out as a person of interest. Now, 3 weeks later, on the 3rd of April in 1997, a 24-year-old labourer named Jason was working in the Eglinton area, which was about 40 kilometres north of Perth, and it was also a rural area. It was like a bushland. And while he was there working, he discovered Cara's body in the scrub. He ran down, told his boss, immediately called the police, and when they got there, they actually made him sign a confidentiality agreement so that he couldn't tell anybody anything of the details of what he saw that day. And just like with Jane Rimmer, they never disclosed any information about her cause of death. After they discovered her body, Paul Ferguson appealed to the public to, ask them if anybody had noticed any suspicious activity, particularly somebody who had come home the night of her disappearance in the early hours of the morning and had, cleaned their car. They were constantly appealing to the public, asking them for help, for any information that they could give, but they never released any information to the public to help them at all. So at this point, there were signs everywhere. There were posters in bars, in pubs, telling women to be careful and not to go anywhere alone. The party scene, as I mentioned, was absolutely huge. Claremont was like the place to be. But this was drastically different. People were too scared to go out. I mean, every single one of these girls, was out, on a night out with friends. So people were just too scared to go out. People were very, very wary of taxis. In fact, 2,500 taxi drivers were asked for voluntary DNA swabs because they were under such heavy scrutiny at the time. And this DNA swab actually eliminated a bunch of drivers, but it didn't give a single person of interest. It was actually the first ever mass DNA swab in Australian history. So they were really just coming up empty-handed, and Dennis and Neil decided to take things into their own hands, using their own connections to create the Secure Community Foundation. And they raised over $600,000 from their friends and businesses in the community to put towards resources for the investigation into these disappearances, which actually did come under a little bit of scrutiny because people thought that they were only focusing on Cara's disappearance and not the other 2 girls, but this $600,000 was to look into all 3 cases. So this money paid for international experts to be flown in. It also paid for a lie detector to come and be brought over to Australia because Australia didn't use lie detectors at the time. They also used quite a few unconventional methods in this investigation, the lie detector being one of them, because Australia didn't use lie detectors, and lie detectors aren't very reliable either, which we'll get into in a little bit. They also used the help of clairvoyants. They like listened to them, followed their leads, obviously didn't find anything, and Paul Ferguson actually decided to interview David Burney, which if you guys haven't heard of him, he's also another serial killer from Perth. And David Burney actually called him and said, hey, if you want to come and interview me, I can give you my perspective from a serial killer's point of view. And Paul Ferguson decided to take him up on this offer. He went down to the prison to interview him. He never disclosed the details of that interview, but just said that it was helpful. Shortly after this, Paul Ferguson was actually removed as the head of the task force, and they replaced him with a guy named Dave Capehorn. And it was actually under Dave Capehorn that they had their first major prime suspect in September of 1997, and his name was Lance Williams. So how they actually caught on to Lance Williams was they actually had a few decoy girls hanging around Claremont at the time. Like, they were police officers, undercover police officers, and they noticed that this guy was circling around Claremont a bunch of times every single night in his white Hyundai sedan, and they just thought this was a little bit weird and decided to look into him. He didn't really have many friends. He had 5 siblings and only got along with one of his brothers. He showed severe signs of depression and had actually attempted suicide twice. He worked at a bank from age 17 to 28 and struggled really badly with alcoholism. So it was to the point where he actually had 3 drink driving convictions. And on the 3rd time, he lost his license for 10 years in 1984. Then in 1995, one of his friends died, and he just went cold turkey on everything. He stopped drinking, stopped smoking, and stopped gambling all at once, just like that. And police sort of thought that maybe this triggered him to start committing crimes. In June of 1996, he went through a pretty hard time. He actually had to go to a psychiatric hospital, and when he got out, he moved back into his parents' house, and then shortly after, he ended up moving out on his own again to Cottesloe, which, as I mentioned before, is literally the next suburb on from Claremont. And as I mentioned before as well, police were working under the theory that this person had to have lived in the area. So obviously he was living in the area at the time, and they decided to put heavy surveillance on him day and night. When they had surveillance on him, they noticed that every single Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, he would do the exact same thing. He would go do about 3 laps around the Claremont area. He would then go to Hungry Jack's, drive about 20 minutes away to Northbridge, the exact same route every single time, would come back, throw his chocolate shake in the same bin every single time, and then he would just loop around the Claremont area up to like 30 times a night before heading home. So obviously they found this really sketchy. They had the decoy undercover police officers doing the same 15 routes every night that he was around. They also had 50 police in total surveillancing him at the time, and 2 months later, on the 5th of April in 1998, on a Sunday, they decided to stop him and question him. And when they stopped him, he actually wet himself. So they took him down to the police station to ask him some questions, and not once did he complain. He answered every single question, was extremely cooperative, and never once asked for a lawyer. They held him there for 13 hours. And he also did have an alibi for Kira's disappearance. He also agreed to do a polygraph test, so they brought the polygraph back over to Australia, and he actually failed it. But I take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, because they did do a polygraph test on 50 persons of interest. 6 of them failed, 6 passed. I think 4 refused to do it, and then all of the rest of them were uncertain. So I just don't think polygraphs are very reliable. I mean, he's not the only person that failed. So such a huge amount of them were uncertain as well. So, I mean, what does that go to show? But either way, the police found this really sketchy that he failed. I think it's because they were really like honing in on him, and they just pretty much had tunnel vision just for this one guy. So they decided to search his apartment, search his parents' place. They also searched his car. They didn't find anything. They also decided to increase their surveillance on him, which is when they found that he visited sex workers, sometimes up to 3 times a night. So it was very frequent. And sometimes he would spend up to $300 at a time with each sex worker. They also thought that some of the sex workers he did visit resembled the Claremont victims. So they decided to install surveillance footage at his home and at his work. And at his work, it was about the size of a mobile phone. They had it like above his desk, and it literally just like fell out and was dangling by a thread just above his desk. And he was not at all like shocked by this. It's like he knew what was going on. They decided to question some of his female co-workers as well, who said that they asked not to be alone with him because sometimes he could have a bit of a temper. Some people really accused Dave Capehorn of just having tunnel vision on this guy because, I mean, sometimes other people on the task force reported going up to him with other leads and whatever, and he would just say, "Nah, don't worry about it, mate, we've got our guy." It was to a point where Lance would call up the police to let them know if he was going to be doing something that was a little bit out of the ordinary. The police took him in for questioning 6 times, and not once did he ever complain. Every single time he was extremely cooperative, and he never once asked for a lawyer. But finally, in November of 1999, the surveillance stopped, and he was not a person of interest anymore. Over the years, they released only small bits of information at a time. In 2004, they decided to release information about the fact that small souvenirs were taken from every single one of the crime scenes. So in Sarah Spears' case, it was a sunflower ring. In Jane's case, it was a small bag. And in Kira's case, it was a clatter brooch. I don't know what the first word is or how to say it. In 2005, they decided to raid Stephen Ross's place, which, if you remember, is the taxi driver from Sarah Spears' case. They were raiding it in regards to some sort of tip they had gotten, and they were looking for clothes of the victims, but didn't find anything. In September of 2005, the Macro Task Force was disbanded and the Special Crime Squad took over, which is when they found a new suspect named Anthony Clair. So he had been convicted of raping a 16-year-old girl in Essex in England, and he actually lived in Claremont at the time of the Claremont abductions and murders and was a person of interest back in 1999. So when he was convicted of this rape, they decided to request some DNA to compare it to the Claremont victims, and they also flew to England so that they could question him. However, he was eliminated as a suspect shortly after. In 2008, that is when they released the CCTV footage of Jane Rimmers that I mentioned earlier. And then in 2009, they had a major breakthrough in the case, which they actually didn't release any information about until October of 2015. Now, this breakthrough was that the police actually made a forensic match between Cara Glennon and a teenage girl who was abducted and raped in February of 1995, so just 11 months before Sarah Spears' disappearance. Now, the case that Cara was connected to was a rape and abduction of a 17-year-old girl. The victim in this case was walking home from Club Bayview when a man jumped out, put a bag over her head, tied her arms up with a washing line, and then threw her in the boot of his car. Everything happened so quickly that she didn't catch a glimpse of the attacker, and after he raped her, he dropped her off at a cemetery completely naked, and she had to run to a nearby hospital for help. So the method for this was obviously extremely different to the Claremont victims, but you know, methods change, and also their method, or the method they thought was taking place, how they willfully got into the cars, was just a theory, so it could have been incorrect and the girls could have been abducted. In December of 2015, police revealed information that the killer drove a white mid-90s model Holden Commodore VS Series 1, which they were able to determine because they found fibers of this exact car, like the upholstery of this exact car in Jane Rimmer's hair. A year later, on the 22nd of December in 2016, Bradley Robert Edwards was arrested in relation to the deaths of Cara Glennon and Jane Rimmer. The next day, on the 23rd of December, he was charged with both attacks and also with 2 other attacks, which we'll talk about in a second. One of them was against the 17-year-old in 1995, and one of them was against an 18-year-old in Huntingdale in 1988. Then later, on the 22nd of February, he was charged with the willful murder of Sarah Spears, and his trial is actually set for July of this year. And he has denied all allegations against him. Just a little side note as well. He recently, this year in February, was taken to the hospital because he was injured in the prison in the showers. There was like an ear injury and they found a pencil in the shower. He was actually taken to the exact same hospital that my grandma was at. So bizarre. Okay, so anyway, let's talk a little bit about the evidence against this guy. So the prosecution was trying to bring in a whole bunch of evidence against this guy, and each of the evidence categories were named. So the first category of evidence was called the Huntington Prowler. So basically in January and February of 1988, a whole bunch of women's undergarments were stolen from a clothes line in Huntingdale, and also a silk kimono. Apparently, then a man also broke into a woman's home wearing this silk kimono that was stolen. That same night, the same man was actually trying to get into somebody's rear door, but then somebody in the household saw him and he ran off. The same man also broke into the family home of an 18-year-old woman. He unplugged all of the phone lines and also tried to attack her. In December of 2016, 3 out of 4 prints that were found were matched to Edwards, and they also tried to argue that he had a fetish for women's underwear. Sorry guys, I just realized that my microphone actually died, so some of this audio is probably gonna suck. Okay, so anyway, the next piece of evidence is called the Telstra Living Witness Project, and before we get into it, I do want to mention that the title of that reminded me that this Edwards guy is a 50-year-old guy that actually works for Telstra. So anyway, this piece of evidence basically suggests that Edwards in 1996 and 1995 would drive around the Cottesloe and Claremont area in his Telstra issued work car and would stop and offer women lifts. Apparently he told one woman that he was looking for damsels in distress like her, and then he grabbed her and tried to kiss her. Another time, a white male in a Telstra, like in a car with a Telstra logo on it, stopped and stared at 2 women for a while, making them uncomfortable before driving away. Now, the next piece of evidence was called the Hollywood Hospital evidence. So this piece of evidence basically talks about allegations that when he was working at a hospital as a Telstra technician, he tried to attack an older social worker while she was sitting in a chair. He tried to put something in her mouth to gag her, but she managed to kick him and break free, and then later when he was arrested, they noticed that he had cable ties in his pockets. So he was convicted of common assault and received 2 years probation. The next piece of evidence is called the car cutter evidence, and this piece of evidence is basically about the 17-year-old girl that he abducted and raped in 1995, which I told you guys earlier, and the reason it's called the Cara Glennon evidence is because the cemetery that he dropped her at was the Cara Glennon cemetery. And swabs from the victim matched Edwards' DNA. That's how he was tied to the Claremont killings victims in the first place. Now, the final category of evidence I'm trying to present is called the Claremont series, which is about the 3 victims that we've spoken about in today's video. The last time Sarah Spears was seen, she was actually leaning up against a Telstra bollard while she was waiting for a taxi. Not long after this, a series of blood-curdling screams were heard by some residents at Mosman Park. A witness also claimed to have seen a white or cream car matching the description of one of the 2 Telstra vehicles that Edwards was given access to via his work, parked on the wrong side of the road, which raised suspicions. And this information, by the way, wasn't actually released to the public until it was all presented in court, which was literally this year, which is why I didn't talk about it earlier, because I didn't want it to get too confusing. Now, when Jane Rimmer's body was found, a witness also found a Telstra logo knife. It was a standard issue Telstra knife which had been issued to many other employees, but one had also been issued to Bradley Edwards. They also presented evidence which suggested that they found 2 other knives of similar descriptions in a toolbox in Edwards' car. They also revealed that DNA taken from Cara Glennon's body and under her fingernails was a match to Bradley Edwards' DNA as well, and they also said that fibers found in her hair matched the upholstery in his car that was issued to him through Telstra, which they seized in 2017. Cara's cause of death was also released in this information, and they said that her cause of death was consistent with her neck having been cut. The night of her disappearance as well, Edwards was meant to spend time with friends but never showed up, and then the next day he told them that the reason he didn't show up was because he was trying to reconcile things with a previous partner of his. They also found evidence of violent pornography on his computer and also like stories on his computer which were very similar to the abductions of the 3 Claremont victims. So on his computer they found files which were titled like the Nicholas story, Chloe's story, Sophie's story, and these stories were basically about non-consensual sex and abduction of women that were very similar to the Claremont victims. Now, I did read that the judge didn't allow the pornography, the violent, non-consensual pornography found on his computer and the stories that were found on his computer to be allowed into evidence. They also didn't, or the judge also didn't allow an application to have the rape and abduction of the 17-year-old girl in 1995 tried separately to the Claremont victims. So that is all for now. The trial is set to start in July, so I'm sure that I will have updates for you guys after that. I think it's apparently going to be a 9-month-long trial, and at this stage, they have 580 witnesses that they're planning on calling. I did read that they were going to try and get that number down, but gee whiz, that is a lot of witnesses. So that is everything for today's case, and I'm sure that I will have updates for you guys for this case in the future, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video. Bye guys!